Hi all. I just wanted to make a quick disclaimer regarding this particular episode. I do not necessarily share the views and ideologies of my guests. I am interested in hearing different perspectives, and a guest's appearance on the WTF is on My Mind podcast does not mean I believe or support their particular point of view on all matters.
Even in the face of evidence that we now know in a great deal of detail, that when politicians say, oh, well, most people go into politics because they are interested in helping people and they're interested in helping their constituents. Bollocks. You've got to be, and you are narcissistic to go into politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from Liverpool this time. I just finished this weekend being part of a seminar that Richard Grannon put on called Narcissistic Psychopathy. Did I get that right? Narcissistic Psychopathy. If you missed the live stream, you can go to Richard's site and you can watch it there in a few weeks from the time that I'm recording this podcast. That's www.richardgrannon.com. Is that correct? That is correct. Before we get to today's guest, if you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe so that I can feel like I'm finally worthy. If you're on podcast platforms, I've been in the UK for a few days and my accent's very fucked up right now. If you're on podcast platforms, please give me at minimum, a 5-star rating. And I also want to let you know this podcast is made possible because of my Patreon members. If you'd like to support the work I'm doing, please go to www.patreon.com/Mark Vicente. So one of the esteemed guests at the seminar was none other than Professor Edward Dutton. I have to take my glasses off to read this. Edward Dutton is a professor of evolutionary psychology who studies human biological differences and intelligence. He graduated in theology from Durham University in 2002, focusing on religious studies and editing the book Anthropology and Theology. He completed his PhD in religious studies at Aberdeen University in 2005, researching Christian fundamentalism. Oh, joy. In 2011, he became docent, not so bad, of the Anthropology of Religion and Finnish Culture at Oulu University, Finland. I'm going to butcher words here, just so you know. Dutton transitioned to evolutionary psychology and human biological differences in 2012, a move highlighted as Dutton's dilemma by the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. He's contributed to quantitative studies with the Ulster Institute for Social Research, that's a lot of words, and published in various journals. He has held positions at Umeå University, King Saud University, and Tabuk University. In 2020, he was appointed Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at Asborough University, Poland. I know I messed that up. Despite facing academic cancellation due to controversial views, Dutton continues his research and shares his findings on his YouTube channel, The Jolly Heretic. I suggest you check it out. He's the author of over 20 books, including At Our Wits' End, Why We Are Becoming Less Intelligent and What It Means for the Future, Breeding the Human Herd, Eugenics Dysgenic and the Future of the Species, and The Past is a Future Country, The Coming Conservative Demographic Revolution. Professor? Thank you.
You did well. You did well with the pronunciation. It was pretty good. It's Oulu.
Oulu.
And Umeå. And, it was good.
Not too bad.
It was good. It's good Scandinavian language skill.
Not too bad for a foreigner. Let me start with, do you hear my accent? I usually say start, and now I say, let me start with.
You're becoming Afrikaans, are you?
I don't know what's happening. You have a pin on your jacket, and when I met you, I sort of looked at the pin. It says, I can't read it. I'm autistic. Please be patient.
Yes.
You are autistic?
No, I've not been diagnosed as autistic, but I was told I have some of the traits. So I'm very focused on sort of pattern spotting and systematizing. I'm very sensitive to various kinds of sensations. I suppose I can be quite rigid. I don't like. I hate change passionately, and so I probably have some of the symptoms. But no, I think it was a bit of a joke. Really, it's this idea that we've reversed the normal hierarchy. So the normal hierarchy, until really quite recently, was based around power and health. And if you had a problem that deviated from that, then you would suppress it. You would lie that you didn't have it. You would play it down. Now we do the opposite. We have a grievance hierarchy that's based around a kind of worship of weakness, essentially, a worship of having things wrong with you, and it ironically gives you a kind of social kudos to be able to assert, oh, I'm bipolar, I'm autistic, I'm disabled, whatever it happens to be, such that people who really aren't autistic or whose children aren't autistic would rather like them to be diagnosed as such so that they can get a kind of social cachet from so doing. And so somebody bought me this badge as a bit of a joke. And it's a kind of get out of jail free card, because if I find myself, it's a problem, I know, but if I find myself, let's say, in a group of left-wing people explaining views that are congruous with the empirical evidence, and this upsets them, then all I have to do is show them this, and they will take that very seriously, and suddenly they'll go from condemning me as an evil, vile man to saying, oh well, maybe you have a point about mutational load being elevated in people with left-wing views or whatever. So it's worth doing. So it's a protection thing,
So you're self-diagnosed. You haven't been officially diagnosed.
No.
Right. So you've mentioned some of the things, but what's it like? I guess. I don't think I am autistic, but what's it like for you in terms of sensations? You said, like, what's it like with all the sensations? Because I feel like I can filter things out pretty well. What's it like for you?
No, I'm very, very sensitive to sound, so I will wear earplugs in bed and sometimes even workman's earphones. When I work, I will sometimes do that. So I remove all sound, and this allows me to become completely absorbed in my work, and I'll start typing, and then I'll look up, and 4 hours has gone by, so I can become completely absorbed in what I'm doing. It's also there's a rigidity to it. If you see the world as surrounded by all kinds of chaos, then you like order and structure, and so I like order and structure. I don't like change. I hate lateness. I hate lateness so much. This morning it was 10:54, and we agreed to meet at 10:45, and you weren't there, and this made me angry. But then it turned out that you'd left early, you'd come here. Maybe it's an autistic trait in you that you wanted to make sure everything was organised and perfect. I'm a control freak. OCD, who knows?
Yes.
And so then I was slightly more sympathetic to your failure to be there.
Yes, I assigned a doorman to bring you here.
Ah, yes, you did indeed, yes. And then another thing that happens is sometimes I know it's that I'm making statements that are outrageous, and but empirically true, but are outrageous, and I quite enjoy sort of tickling them up. It's quite interesting. But other times I can upset people really without meaning to, and then I'm, oh God, what have you done now?
So you miss the social cues.
Yeah, like subtle social cues. So I was interviewing some chap the other day. I'm not going to use the footage, but I ended up accidentally making him cry. And then he walked out of the room, and it turned out there'd been some horrible thing in the family. And the thing that I was asking about, I think I asked what his dad did for a living, which I thought was a perfectly reasonable question. Yeah. But apparently I should have read the social cues leading up to that he wasn't happy at the questions that I was asking, but I didn't read that at all. I was just asking him. I have a tendency, I like to treat everybody the same. And I think that's showing a degree of respect to them to treat them the same. And one of the things that happened to me when I was in America last summer filming for a documentary we were making about America, and I was in Detroit, in what was the name of the road? I don't know, this particularly dangerous road. And I was just talking to these African Americans, and one of them commented to me that he'd never been spoken to like that by a white person before. And I was like, what do you mean? And because I had been direct with him, I had said to him, well, look, there's this race difference in intelligence. What do you think about this? And he said, I was treating him basically as I would treat anybody else. And he had noticed that doesn't happen with whites. Whites will sort of talk down to him, really, will not use big words with him, will change their register with him. And there's some evidence that they do that, particularly left-wing whites. They say, we think all people are equal, but they will change their register change the kind of words they use. And people pick up on that. They're intelligent people, and they pick up on the way that these patronising whites are talking to them. But I was talking to him as I would talk to anybody else, and he found this refreshingly honest, he basically said. So I just talked to them as I would.
So he was used to being talked down at a child.
By white people he was,
By white people.
Yeah.
Interesting. So your channel, The Jolly Heretic, why the name The Jolly Heretic? Clearly you're a heretic.
Oh, well, yeah, it was that some years ago, there was this conference we had, the London Conference on Intelligence, which was, of course, cancelled in the woke sense of the word. And so and I was doing various presentations and so forth, and people liked them. They said they're funny, they were good, and you should set up a YouTube channel. And I said, no, that's for the young people. That's for the that's for the millennials and the Generation Z. I can't do that, because I don't like change and I don't like new things. But then gradually I was persuaded around to do so. And I thought, what should I call it? And I thought, well, people say I'm a heretic and people say I'm quite sort of jolly in the way I present my information. And then I was thinking that what about the idea of an online pub? And I thought because people have said things like foreigners said I'm so stereotypically English. Well, what's more English than a pub? So an online pub. And there's a pub name that we have in England, the Jolly Farmer. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a pub where you've got a sort of rotund farmer there smiling on the side? And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a heretic there burning to death in the 1550s in England, smiling? And it's because the Jolly Heretic. And so I thought, what about that? The Jolly Heretic. So that's where it came from. And then I thought, well, there should be probably a catchphrase. I've noticed that a lot of these YouTubers have catchphrases. And so I just thought, well, hello, hello, hello. And then at the end, I'll shout like goodbye. And then it just sort of, I don't know, I don't understand it myself. It just sort of took off. And at first, there was a contact I had that had quite a lot. He used to have. She's completely gone off the internet now. Quite a significant YouTube channel, and she sort of helped me out and said you should go on Twitter, which I wasn't on, and you should do this, you should do that. Sort of showed me the ropes, and then very quickly I was on. She knew a number of contacts with quite reasonable followings, and then very quickly I was on those, and then it just I don't know. I was first thought I'll just make videos that relate to promoting my research, but then I started making them, and then people seemed to like them, and then I did one video where I did a sort of skit at the beginning where I dressed as a vicar. It was on the relationship between religion and intelligence, and people particularly liked that. So then it became a sort of expected that I should do these skits at the beginning, comedy sketches really. And I used to write comedy sketches when I was at university, and so then it just sort of went from there. I don't know really. It's an odd thing.
I love it. I mean, I do enjoy looking at your thumbnails because you're always wearing a different wig. Usually, not always. All right, so try not to get me cancelled by Google Skynet with this next question.
Right. I don't know what that is, but okay.
Oh, Skynet is the thing that eventually takes everything over. It's what Google is becoming.
I see.
That will probably get me cancelled as well. Anyway, so what exactly are your controversial views according to others?
Well, they are views which do not fit in with this ersatz new religion we have, really, of wokeness. They are viewed, but they're not even my views. I mean, they're me stating what the empirical evidence indicates. So they say, oh, Dutton thinks this. Dutton, no, I don't think it at all. I am telling you what the empirical studies have said. That's all. So I think it. It's not my opinion. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact. Even saying that for postmodernists, saying that there can be something that such thing as fact can occasionally be triggering, even though, of course, they don't live life like that. I mean, if that was the case, then I'm amazed that they fly aeroplanes, because all that's, as Richard Dawkins once commented, all that's keeping them 30,000 feet in the air, all that's keeping them away from the ploughed field is that a number of Western-trained engineers have got their sums right. But nevertheless, it is simply views that were perfectly acceptable 50 or 60 years ago because they were empirically accurate with regard to differences in race, differences in sex, differences in other human psychological differences which are genetic in origin and are therefore differences in intelligence and are therefore intractable. So there is this idea we've had for a long time, certainly since the war, it's become more and more popular, or even before that, really starting in the 20s, people like Margaret Mead and Franz Boas, there was this reaction against the hereditarianism of the previous period. And the hereditarianism, it's true, went too far. It took the view that almost everything was to do with genetics. It wasn't. Now we're realizing that it depends on the trait, but it's approximately, our differences, psychological differences particularly, are approximately, on average, about 50% to do with genes and about 50% to do with environmental factors, though those are themselves within genetic limitations or underpinned by genetic differences. And so then you look at those in relation to certain sanctified issues, or you dare to question with regard to, for example, the trans movement. You look at the research indicating it's not random people that are born into the wrong body. There are certain disorders that are strongly associated with basically mind-body dysmorphia. It's not random. And so I'm just interested in these things. And also, I suppose, it's something about me, I suppose, I don't know, I am a controversialist. If you tell me that this is the facts, and if you doubt this or dissent from it in any way, then you're evil, then I'm afraid that the contrarian in me just thinks, well, clearly, therefore, the very fact that you have reacted in that way means that you are not certain of the veracity of your views. That's why you have to be dogmatic. You have secret doubts. And so, therefore, the fact that you have secret doubts means that that is where the empirical truth lies. And I want to know the empirical truth. So I wasn't interested in transsexuality at all until it became this thing that, oh, you're not allowed to talk about, or people, or you have to to call people by their desired pronouns or whatever, which is insane. I mean, it's equivalent to in sort of early modern England that you would have to address members of the nobility in certain ways, and if you didn't, if you cheeked them, you would be punished for this. They had to be addressed in the way they wanted to be addressed, right? You had to show due deference, and it's what like these people are saying. They're saying, I'm a member of the nobility. This is how you are to address me. And worse than that, this is how you are to. I say I am. It's a very primitive thing. I say I am something, and therefore I am something. It's like a child's fantasy. When my daughter was 2 or 3, she would pretend to be a princess. But children are so malleable in their thinking and fantastical. Oh, I am a princess. Well, it's projection. It's very simple technique, and it's absurd. It gets us to a point where we almost have a theology where because who is it that defines himself? It's God. It's in the Bible. I am that I am, saith the Lord. And so it's almost like we're so narcissistic as a culture, to refer back to the conference that we, of course, have met at, that we have created a theology whereby we are little gods. We are little chinks of divine light in the darkness. That's what we all are. And we define who we are. And the devil are these bad chinks of divine light that don't accept our definitions of who we are, and refer towards such a thing as objective reality and objective truth. I mean, it's crazy. And that's the situation we've got ourselves into. It's essentially a kind of Gnosticism.
Yeah, it's definitely cultish. So I want to read something that either you wrote or somebody wrote about you. It says, "Why are people religious? I recall wondering about age 11." Did you write this?
It sounds like
you. "Why do you tell us that Father Christmas isn't real, yet believe in a kind of invisible Father Christmas who created the world? Yes, I was that kind of child. Science classes could have explained it to me that in Darwinian terms, something is an adaptation if it is partly genetic, found in all cultures, and associated with mental and physical health and fertility. Religion is therefore an adaptation, and that is why otherwise perfectly rational people will believe it and engage in it. It is in effect an instinct whereby a number of other instincts, following the leader, over-detecting agency and causation, the feeling of being watched, which makes you more pro-social, the feeling of being looked after, which guards against anxiety and despair, are all selected for and so become bundled together." So religion is an adaptation. What do you mean by that?
Well, an adaptation is something which helps you to survive and to flourish in a particular ecology. So if you look at the difference, but if you look at our eyes, for example, or anything like that, it's not come about randomly. It's survival in a particular ecology, and there are mental adaptations, what we might call instincts, that they tend to be elevated at times of stress and mortality salience, i.e., when we're in our evolutionary match. And religion is an example of this. So what you have is a number of instincts that are adaptive. It's adaptive. Over-detecting agency or causation is adaptive because if you are in the forest and you hear a sound and you think it's a wolf, but it's a stick snapping, you've lost nothing. Whereas if you reverse that, you've lost everything. So it benefits you to over-detect agency, and then this could be transposed over into the world itself, and therefore you would detect a hidden hand behind events, and therefore you have a conception of God. Or similarly, you are in a social group, and if you upset people in that social group and you're cast out of the band, then you're dead. You're killed by wild animals or whatever. And so it is useful to have a little person sitting on your shoulder telling you to be pro-social. And if you're highly empathetic, then often you will transpose that over into the world itself, and you will conceive of evidence in the world of external signals of internal states, i.e., a mind behind the world. So there are a number of instincts like this, and they're all adaptive. So they become bundled together, and then you end up with something like religion, or at least primitive religion. And as I say, this has been there are certain accepted markers that something is adaptive. It's adaptive if it elevates fertility, obviously. It's adaptive if it's associated with health, because we are selecting for health, so mental health, physical health. It's adaptive if it's an adaptation if it hits in at times of stress. It's an adaptation if there are certain parts of the brain that are associated with it, and we know that if you stimulate the anterior frontal cortex with magnets, then you become both more religious and more ethnocentric. And it's adaptive to be ethnocentric, because then it means that your group survives, and two random members of the same ethnic group are more closely related to each other than, a random Frenchman and a random Englishman. And so it's in your genetic interest to defend your own people, and so that makes sense that those things would come together. And so in all of these ways, it is an adaptation, and it would have been strongly selected for under the pre-modern harsher conditions that we endured until about 1800.
So it's almost like we don't know if there's a God, but it's almost a emergent property of civilization that we believe there's a God.
Interesting. I think it's a sort of symbiotic relationship. This is interesting. So you can imagine that what you have with the more simple social groups is you have a belief in totems or a belief in lots of gods, spirits, whatever. But people tend to know each other. They know each other. So you can monitor whether your pro-social behavior is reciprocated, and you are only dealing with people that are the same tribe as you, the same group as you. And so in that sense, they're all related to you probably quite closely, probably, third cousin at most. And so it's in your genetic interest to cooperate with them. Now, when you get larger societies, where you get agriculture, for example, and then you get larger polities, villages, and then you get an excess of resources, and then you're able to have some people that don't work in agriculture, and then you get the development of cities, and then you get a situation where we need something to help us cooperate with people who we may never see again. How do you do that? How do you militate in favor of making people, because in computer models, the group which is high in positive and negative ethnocentrism, positive internal cooperation, negative ethnocentrism is fighting the outsider, tends to dominate all other groups. So how do you bring that about? How do you make these people cooperate? And one way would be what's called big gods, that is to say moral gods, gods that are concerned with morality. And if somebody else believes in the same God that you do, then that can, even though they're a stranger, that can be seen as that those gods will have told them to behave in a certain moral way, and therefore it's an insurance policy that you can trust them that they will not cheat on you or whatever, because they follow those gods. And in the same way, it's been suggested that sexual selection works in two directions. So women sexually select; they do the bulk of sexual selection for a certain kind of man, high status, tall, whatever. This is why intelligent. This is why there is a weak genetic correlation between height and intelligence in men, because they've become bundled together. Men also do some sexual selection, and in a society, in a complex society in which they can't monitor their females for their females, cuckolding them, then it makes sense that you're going to sexually select for religious women, because religious women it's an insurance policy that they're not going to cuckold you, because the rules are that you can't do that, and they're religious and they really believe in the gods, and they believe that they're going to go to hell if they do it and whatever. And so you can see how men would sexually select for religious women, and so perhaps that's one of the reasons perhaps why women are on average more religious than men, which they are in all societies.
That is interesting. I want to just shift gears slightly. I heard you say somewhere, perhaps on YouTube, and I'm thinking about this, as a person that was in a cult, and because there are people that were in my cult that still believe in the cult leader despite the evidence, who are highly educated, went to very prestigious universities, but still believe in him, despite the evidence, despite the fact that he's in prison. And you said at one point, intelligent people are more easily open to manipulation. Did I have that correct?
That's a reasonable summary.
Something like that. Can you explain that?
Well, what is this thing, intelligence? Intelligence is about solving problems, and it's about solving. But normally, it's only useful in so much as one is able to solve problems in pursuit of adaptive things. Intelligence in itself, if you're just super intelligent, can be a problem because at very high levels there is some evidence that intelligence is associated with autistic traits, and these kinds of things would upset the band and get you killed and things like that. So a certain optimum level of intelligence is going to be important. And that optimum level of intelligence is going to help you to achieve things that are ultimately related to passing on your genes, i.e. socioeconomic status. Because in pre-modern societies, for example, in Stuart England and Tudor England, the richer 50% of the population, based on parish records and wills, had about double the completed fertility of the poorer 50%. So we had that survival, what Gregory Clark of UC of I forget which university he's at, California, calls the survival of the richest. And of course the richest were also more intelligent and more probably on average pro-social traits associated with socioeconomic status, and these are partly genetic, and so we were selecting for this across time. So intelligent people are better at pursuing those kinds of goals with their intelligence. They are better at norm mapping. They look around the world and they notice what the dominant set of values is, and they understand that adopting the dominant set of values is going to be in your interests in terms of socioeconomic status and breeding and that kind of thing. And they have the effortful control to force themselves, essentially, to adopt and believe those dominant values, which is why it's so easy to understand in Eastern Germany why so many people could just go from being Nazis to being communists, practically overnight, because and it would be the more intelligent that would do that. And then once they have adopted those dominant values, they will competitively signal those values, so that in a society that is broadly conservative, that is concerned with what we might call binding values, group-oriented values of obeying the leader and in-group loyalty and sanctity versus disgust, then it will become more and more and more. It will be like what you had in Victorian England, really, kind of purity signalling. And it goes on and on and on until it gets to the point that at the end of Victorian England, they're censoring Chaucer and censoring Shakespeare and all kinds of stuff, which was completely acceptable a couple of hundred years earlier. And then the reverse. You can have a society that's concerned with equality and harm avoidance, which is the values, the individually oriented values that we are concerned with. And then you get runaway equality signaling and other social harm signaling. And then we get to the point that we have got to now, where we can't say that black is black and white is white, but because it might hurt someone, the feelings of basically some narcissist that has hijacked aspects of society. So so
we're back in the Victorian era, basically.
Well, yes, it's in many ways. And when I say the Victorian era, I mean more like the mid-Victorian era rather than the end of it. I have an idea with my colleague J.O.A. Rayner-Hills called the priestly cycle of universities. And you notice this, that the universities are founded by geniuses. Geniuses have outlier high IQ and subclinical psychopathology or perhaps narcissistic traits, which means that they are able to come up with original and brilliant ideas. They have low conscientiousness, so that means they break the rules. They're able to think outside the box. They have low agreeableness, so they don't care if their ideas offend, or indeed they're too autistic to understand that they will offend. And to some extent, perhaps they have high mental instability, which means that they're constantly thinking and ruminating and therefore coming up with thoughts. And they combine that with outlier high intelligence, and they come up with brilliant ideas. The universities then gain prestige because of the association with all these brilliant, innovative ideas. And the midwit, the person that has high IQ but within the normal range, what we might call the head girl at school, then in they come, and they, of course, will use their intelligence to take the dominant worldview and signal with it. And they therefore turn the university into a branch of whatever the contemporary church is. And then, of course, then we get concerned with dogma and all this kind of thing. The geniuses are antithetical to that because the geniuses are these antisocial people. So they get driven out of the universities. The universities then just become finishing schools for the upper classes and whatever, and basically a waste of time. The geniuses are now in different institutions like the dissenting academies or foreign institutions or whatever. The universities lose prestige, the bubble bursts, and the universities have to reform, bring the geniuses back in, and then the process just begins all over again. And we've seen exactly this process play out. It used to be that if you wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge or Durham, which were the only universities in England, you had to be a practicing Anglican. Simple as that. And so all of these intelligent people that were religious dissenters, and by the way, religious dissent would perhaps be associated with aspects of intelligence, I would think, because it's skeptical of religion. Then they had the dissenting academies, or you went to the university in Scotland or in the Netherlands, because all university was in Latin in those days, so you could go abroad, or Germany perhaps. If you look at English prime ministers, if you go back to the 18th century, the cleverer ones, the noticed, are not educated at Oxford or Cambridge. They go to Glasgow or whatever, or Aberdeen or Leiden or somewhere like that, Groningen. And so this is the process we're going through. I think what's interesting in our lifetimes, is that I think there was an optimum period of creativity between the two processes. So we had a period where the right-wing society, the conservative society, the society of Anglicanism, the society of all that, the pre-1963 society, as it were, that was on the wane. And the new religion of political correctness, woke, whatever you want to call it, was starting, but it hadn't got too high yet. And so there was this optimum period between perhaps, 1960 and the year 2000, something like that, where there was real freedom. And now we've just reverted to type. We've just reverted back to a society where you've got to be careful what you say about the priest, and you've got to, do you know the poet Philip Larkin?
Yeah,
and there's a poem by him, High Windows, and he talks about this. He talks about this. He says, "When I see man and a woman, and I know that he's fucking her and she's taking pills or got a diaphragm, I know this is paradise." And all bonds and gestures pushed aside like an outdated combine harvester, and he's talking about that, and we've got this freedom now, but then at the end he misses. I think of the high windows, sun comprehending glass. There's a nostalgia for the old time of religion, and I think there was this period, and you see a great deal of creativity. Think of the 70s and the 80s and all of the great comedy. We couldn't do it now because people would be so concerned with the new values of harm avoidance and of equality and upsetting people. And so you can't really have like great comedy, great art. It challenges things, it challenges the society and the conventions, and you can't have that under a dictatorship, where you're so concerned with dogma. In the same way, you look at the film industry now, you can't have realistic films. You have to have socially unrealistic situations. And it's the same if you go back to the 30s. When they first started making the talkies, there was no code, there was no moral code, and very quickly the woke people of the time, which were right-wing people, which were conservative people, which were the church ladies, the purity signalers, got hold of this and said, no, there can be no. If it's a Hollywood movie, there must be no adultery, there must be no sex scenes, there must be nothing, there must be no references to it. That must all go. I forget the name of the code, but there was a code, right? And now we have a new code, where if you want to get an Oscar, you have to represent diversity above all. And there was a period between the two where you could just be realistic, where you could just, to some extent, get people's lives, let's say with comedy, get people's lives and reflect them back at them. Even now, Friends, for God's sake, anodyne, although to be fair, consistently quite funny, comedy is a problem because they are talking in ways that people still do. I mean, realistically, you've got men that are homophobic. Men are. You've got people that are transphobic. Well, people are. You've got all this sort of stuff, like real life. But the guardians of our morality don't take the view that real life should be presented to people. It's like we're children. We shouldn't be presented with real life. That might inspire us to do negative things. We should be presented with with dogma. And so really you just go back to a world of the equivalent of medieval mystery plays, where everything is just propaganda for the message of like you would have perhaps in communist Eastern Europe in earlier times. And that's not consistent with good art.
Yes. Okay. This is a question I've been burning to ask someone like you. I was thinking back to, myself and other people that have been in various cults, and I was noticing there's a way in which, when there's a very powerful leader, perhaps psychopathic, there's kind of a disconnecting from self and just like, okay, they're going to take care of everything. Almost like it feels good to have somebody there who's going to fight the dragons and do all the dirty work. Why do people give their power away to psychopathic leaders? Like, what's going on in terms of evolution there?
Well, in terms of there is a degree to which, one shouldn't exaggerate this, but there is a degree to which that so much of our history was hunter-gathering that there's an extent to which that's still our mindset. There's a researcher called Satoshi Kanazawa who argues that we basically just evolved to the savannah. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration because when we left the savannah, i.e. 10,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution, there was a massive speed up in evolution, huge numbers of new mutations and whatever. And so therefore we are probably adapted to a great extent, we people that are, apart from a number of groups that never adopted farming, we have significantly changed as a consequence of farming. In what we look like, even it's been argued, there is an argument that light skin has come about as a consequence of farming because you focus on one particular crop, let's say corn or whatever, you're not getting enough fruit and vegetables anymore. And so if you have light skin, you can absorb more ultraviolet light from the sun in dark winters, and then you can synthesize that into vitamin D. So but we are, to a certain degree, evolved to a hunter-gatherer ecology. This is an unstable, violent, unpredictable ecology. Now, there is evidence that in those ecologies, yes, intelligent men, optimally intelligent men. There's no point being too intelligent in ecology like that because food is on the trees. There's not that much problem to solve. But more intelligent men do rise to the top. And that's evidenced by the fact that when anthropologists have studied these kinds of groups, it's clearly these people are more socially skilled, these people are more linguistically skilled, these people understand things better. They're cleverer people. So they get to the top and people look up to them. But on the other hand, in a very primitive tribe, let's say the Yanomamo of Venezuela, the fierce people, they are extremely violent and aggressive, and there is a strong degree to which you survive that ecology by being extremely violent and aggressive. And within certain boundaries, the most violent and aggressive man, combined with the intelligence, which ensures that you don't play for status too soon, and then get killed and all this, will get to the top. And so there is a degree to which we are used to a system in which psychopathic people get to the top, and we are also used to a system of warring, of constant group selection and whatever, and fighting between groups. And the man that has the leader will fight himself in those ecologies. It's not like now where you have someone like Rishi Sunak talking about making other people do military service, which he has never done himself. It's a situation in which it's a militarized society, and you look up to the general, to the leader, and what kind of man ends up being the general? It's a man that is fearless. It's a man that will die for the group if necessary. It's a man that will fight to the very last. It's a man that, and those traits, that kind of behavior pattern, that you're fearless, is associated with subclinical or with psychopathology. It's people that will lay down their lives in times of war. I think that's why the traits have to stay in the population, because we need, even in complex societies, because we need people that will do that. Those traits are also associated with inventiveness. So I mentioned earlier the genius. Well, the genius is associated with, it was a study by a guy called Felix Post, and he looked at 291 great men, and he looked at their biographies, and it was clear that the vast majority were psychopaths, and many were subclinical psychopaths, because that's associated with creativity and being able to do things, sort things out, including genius, as it were, at the level of, you can talk about genius as a scientist, but you can talk about a military genius or an artistic genius or political genius. And so those people are going to be subclinically psychopathic as well. Those kinds of people will end up in positions of power and they're able to the extent, I suppose, that they can inspire you. They have this power, they have this confidence, which you have if you're a psychopathic. You have this confidence and this aura. And so they can inspire people to do great things. And so that's why it's those kinds of people that, they have their awful sides to them. Of course they do, as you found in your own experiences, where they will manipulate people, they will often cuckold other men. I mean, a good example is Joseph Smith. Now, Joseph Smith founded this incredibly successful movement. Amazing what he managed to do. And he managed to draw in people, a lot of them from England, actually. At the beginning of Mormonism, there were more Mormons in England, in English port towns, than there were in America. And then Brigham Young told all of them to come to Utah, and Utah is genetically the most English state for that reason. And so he founded this movement. He got all these people involved. He brought in polygamy, so they spread like anything and had loads and loads and loads of children. Now, even before he was in Illinois, I mean, early in the movement, there were people that broke away from him and said he is a prophet, but he's a fallen prophet. Why? Well, because he was saying, God has told me I need to be able to have sex with your wife. So he'd suddenly have these revelations. Oh, yeah, God has told me I need to have sex with your wife, yeah. So that's the flip side of it, I'm afraid. And the problem with the polygamous Mormon sects that still exist, I visited one of them in, it's now moved to Texas, but it was known to be in a place called Colorado City, which is on the border between Arizona and Utah, is you have all these dominant men that have loads of wives and loads of kids. And then you have all these men that can't, all these incels, essentially. And what are you supposed to do with them? You have to get them out of the community somehow, which is what Warren Jeffs, who's himself in prison and is clearly, again, highly charismatic leader, brought in all these rules to make it more conservative, all this, on the other hand, raping his daughter, raping other people's kids, whatever. But that's why we're evolved to follow people like that.
So it feels like we're genetically predisposed to have this almost awe response to these leaders. We've inherited it from way, way back. Because it feels like sometimes in groups, you will follow a leader and you will make decisions that go against your own self-interest.
Yes.
And that just blew my mind.
But that has to be done. So if you think that in group selection, the group that is high in according to computer models of this, the group that is high in positive and negative ethnocentrism, that's the one that wins. And that positive ethnocentrism has to include potentially laying your life down for the group. And in terms of it blowing your mind, you have to remember that there are a number of ways in which you can pass on your genes. Now, you told me earlier that, yesterday when we were having dinner, you don't have children. But that doesn't mean that you don't pass on your genes. You can pass on your genes directly via having children. You can pass on your genes at the level of kin selection. Like, let's say you have nieces and nephews and you invest in them. They have 25% of your genes. So by investing in them, you're elevating your genetic interests. And you can pass on your genes at the group level by fighting enemies of the group, ensuring members of your group do not get killed, and then you're indirectly passing on your genes, which is why the soldier will lay down his life for his group. In a certain set of circumstances, it makes sense. I mean, basically, you should lay down your life for 12 of your cousins or whatever the number is. And so, I mean, this has been calculated. There's a guy called Frank Salter that's done a book called On Genetic Interests, in which he notes that you can literally calculate it. You can say, what is the genetic distance between this culture, this people, and this people? Right. So how many people from that country would have to come to your country for it to be the equivalent of you losing a child? And you can calculate this. And the more genetic distance there is between the countries, the bigger is the genetic impact, the bigger is the loss to your genetic interests of, let's say, 10,000 foreigners come from Denmark to England. That's the equivalent of, losing a few kids. And also, it's the relationship between the two. So two random Englishmen are, unrelated. I mean, they're 12th cousins or something, and they're basically unrelated. But two random Englishmen in comparison to Danish people are about 6th cousins in comparison to Danish people. And then if you get two random Englishmen, and Danish people are very genetically similar to English people. two random Englishmen in relation to two people that are, I don't know, Bantu or Australian Aborigine, they're like twins. Because that's the degree of genetic interest involved. That's the degree of genetic distance between the two groups.
That's so interesting. So there is an evolutionary basis for groups wanting to stay tight and not mix. That's interesting.
But then you can argue it can be more nuanced than that, because you can say, what evolutionary strategy do you follow? Now, one strategy you can follow is the ethnocentric strategy that I mentioned earlier. Another one you can follow is what I call the genius strategy, which is what I think we Northern Europeans, particularly we British, as a South African, I include you in that, that we follow, which is that we're relatively low in ethnocentrism. Not too low. There's an optimum level of it, or at least there used to be. But we're relatively low in it. And this means that you can trade and you can expand, and your gene pool expands. And then because your gene pool expands, you throw up what is a genius. It's random, unlikely genetic combinations. Outlier high intelligence, that's unlikely. They're born to normal range intelligence parents. Genius traits do not breed true in the offspring to the extent that geniuses have children, because they are unlikely genetic combinations. In the same way that, let's say a chap has an IQ of 120, and by random unlikely combinations, the child has an IQ of 150. Or the opposite can happen. It can have a much lower IQ. Right, so you've got something like that. Now, that's more likely the larger is your gene pool. So you expand, and then the two members of the society are less related to each other. So two English people on average are 12th cousins. Two Finns are probably 5th cousins. Now, that means that you have a larger diversity. So the intelligence range among English people is much wider than the intelligence range among Finns or Japanese people. So that means you have more geniuses, but also more people of very low intelligence. Now, in a society that's very harsh, very up against it, the flip side of what this is producing genius, right? It's producing these unlikely combinations, outlier high IQ, subclinical psychopathic traits. But the flip side of that is the criminal, is the antisocial element, the malcontent. And if you're really up against it and just about surviving, like Finland or Japan, then you can't tolerate that. That's just too much. So those genes for psychopathologists selected out, and consequently you don't get much per capita genius. And we've done studies on this, but with my Japanese colleague Ken Yakura, that you just don't. But we have this genius strategy. You expand, you trade, you expand, you trade, you get more and more diversity up to an optimum level that you can then bond together using not ethnocentrism so much, but religion and morality and things like that, and big gods. And this means that you can dominate groups that are more ethnocentric than you, and indeed in the case of the Finns and the Japanese, more intelligent than you, because you produce these geniuses that produce these amazing weapons and whatever else that benefit the group. I call it the genius strategy. And that's why I think we English are, everything, look at all this, electricity, television, who invented everything in the modern world? To a great extent, it is the English and the Scottish, the British anyway.
Okay. Speaking of psychopathic leaders, how do you explain, there's a good deal of the public, maybe it's always been this way, but now it seems really much worse, that has this inability to recognize that their leaders are psychopathic and that they don't have their best interests at heart. Like, I feel people have this Pollyanna attitude about leaders. How do you explain that?
Well, we will we have a very good capacity to. We desire cognitive consonance, and it would create cognitive dissonance to have to accept that we live in this awful world in which psychopathic people get to the top of society and want to hurt us. Those that accept that, i.e. people that, whether they're true or not, that accept conspiracy theories, tend to be high in mental instability and schizoid traits and psychopathic traits, and they're not very happy people. One could say it's a chicken and egg situation. Is it that they are unhappy people and therefore they become paranoid and they adopt those theories, or is it they feed into it that they adopt those theories and they make them unhappy, whatever? But that's the case. Whereas being happy is associated with having basically a positive view of the world, of believing that you have free will, of believing that, even though I don't think we do have free will, believing in agency, believing in God, believing that your life has meaning, believing nice things. And that makes people feel good. And so, therefore, it is adaptive, even in the face of evidence that we now know in a great deal of detail, that when politicians say, oh, well, most people go into politics because they are interested in helping people and they're interested in helping their constituents. Bollocks. You've got to be, and you are narcissistic to go into politics, because you've got to. It takes you're up against all these other the egos floating around. And so you tell yourself this, and then you feel better. I mean, I was when I was 18, I was the secretary of Wimbledon Young Conservatives, and we were selecting a candidate to stand in the 2001 election. There was a safe Conservative seat till 97, but then there was the Blair landslide, and they lost the seat for the first time since 1945. And we had 100 applicants to what I think it would be more now, to what was a Labour seat, which we didn't even win back in 01. We won it back in 05. 100 applicants. And most of them were useless, frankly. But the egos floating around, the idea that you're so good that you can run society, that you can, is so. But we know that's true. And if you meet these people personally, as I have done, then there are certain kind of, certainly they have trait narcissism. Some of them might be quite nice people, some of them, but they have trait narcissism. Others are just, they're just not.
What did you call it? Cognitive consonance?
So cognitive dissonance is the way the world is not congruous with how you kind of want it to be or feel it to be. There's something that you have a system of dogmas, you have a worldview, something contradicts it. Right, that's a problem. That's called cognitive dissonance. You don't feel good. You don't feel good. Well, it doesn't make sense. Maybe you realise you've been lied to, or you realise you've been sucked in, or whatever. Perhaps that you felt this with the cold. Now, how do you deal with this? On the one hand, you can just accept that you're wrong and you've made a mistake, and that can be difficult for people to do, because it can be it can be shattering if you've invested all of your resources, all of your time, or whatever into a particular worldview, or if that worldview is important to you having a positive sense of self, like with woke people, feeling morally superior, whatever. And so you need to create cognitive dissonance. Cognitive consonance. How do you do that? Well, you need to get the person that's criticizing you to just go away. And I think we discussed, I think the other day, this what I call eye glazing, this interesting dissociative process where I think you dissociate, and so you're kind of switching off from listening to the person that's criticizing your religion, or telling you that the Reverend Moon is not God or whatever. But also that the glazing is very unsettling to your interlocutor, and so it's a kind of boundary policing mechanism that makes the interlocutor just go away and insulates you from his difficult questions.
Yes. Okay, so I want to finish off with this. So speaking of cults, and we spoke about this at the beginning, but how do you explain society's current complete departure from scientific reality? That people are just accepting things that just are simply not true.
Well, you could argue that in a very religious conservative society, you have the same thing. Yes. So you have people that will say, so with fundamentalist Christians, for example, and that process began about 1900 as a reaction against liberalization of the church. So first of all, they're saying, okay, biblical literalism, or to some extent, in terms of creation myth or whatever. So that no, there's no evolution. Evolution's not the case. And then it carries on with then a kind of purity signaling until you get people that say, oh, well, dinosaur bones were placed in the world by the devil to confuse the non-believer and to tempt him. Well, that's the same thing. Yeah. Well, what we have is a similar thing. And it can carry on this signaling in a particular direction. In this case, as I've said, these 5 moral foundations that you have because we are a group a pack animal, but we have to ascend the hierarchy to pass on our genes in prehistory because of the survival of the fittest, survival of the wealthiest, I mean. And so you have the individual group-oriented foundations of in-group loyalty and obedience to authority and sanctity, which keeps out foreign bodies and things like this, which might bring disease into the group. And then you have the individually oriented foundations of equality, which means you get your fair share, and harm avoidance, which means you don't get harmed. And we have the left, the right are about the same in all 5 moral foundations, but the left are only interested in the 2 individually oriented foundations. And what you get is basically mentally unstable people that fear a fair fight, mental instability associated with leftism, who therefore play for status covertly in the same way that females will tend to do. And they will signal their concern with harm and signal their concern with equality. And then you get runaway virtue signaling, runaway equality signaling, runaway signaling of harm avoidance. And this will carry on and on and on because there's asymmetric empathy between the left and the right. Remember, the right, all 5 moral foundations, the left only 2. And so it can carry on and on and on and on until it comes up against some kind of wall, some kind of problem which shakes you back into believing in reality again. Because remember, it's not necessarily adaptive to believe in the truth. Within certain boundaries, it's adaptive. But it's not necessarily adaptive. Like people were talking yesterday. It's not like with Stockholm syndrome. How do you survive? Well, you identify with the aggressor. The truth is he's an aggressor and he's horrible. But if you believe that he's kind, then you will behave towards him in such a manner that you are more likely to survive. A lot of philosophers would say there's no God, but it's adaptive to believe in God. Let's assume there's no God. It's adaptive to believe in God. I assert there's no such thing as free will. I don't see how there's any room for it in terms of the physics. But it's adaptive to believe in it. And what evolution is about is passing on your genes, nothing else. That's so interesting. So you can see then how the runaway lies, and they'll carry on until it comes up against until too many people have dysphoria and feel that their group-oriented needs are not met and are unhappy about this and react, or it'll carry on until too many people are thinking this is absurd, like with the trans movement, this is ridiculous, we're not having this, and it creates, i.e. they go too far, and then it creates a reaction, or it carries on until society splits up, or it carries on until it comes up against something which snaps you out of it, like a war or the COVID virus, which suddenly, when that started, we weren't talking about trans rights anymore for quite a while because we'd moved down Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We were struggling more, but now we're back up again talking about it.
Just my final question to you, because I was thinking about the George Orwell section. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. So, given what you just said, I mean, what happens to a society that's being asked to believe in things that are just simply untrue? Like, what happens to their mental health of that society?
Well, one could argue that for all of history, societies have been asked to believe in things that are simply untrue. I mean, in dogmas.
So it's no different?
I think we're just reverting to type. So I think there's been a period of freedom, as I said, where there was a collapse of one set of dogmas and a rise of a new, i.e. traditional religion, and a rise of a new set of dogmas, i.e. wokeness. Similarly, perhaps, did something like this happen towards the end of Rome? It may well have done. Were we more creative? We were actually. There's data on that. You get you get a decline in innovation from the time of Socrates onwards, as intelligence is basically going down because we've created cities, and now people that are intelligent are in an evolutionary mismatch and they're not wanting to have children. And then with the rise of Christianity, you see that the innovation goes back up and then collapses back down again with the collapse of Rome and whatever into the 500s and the Great Justinian Plague. And then it flatlined for a long time. That's interesting. So it may well be that this has literally happened before, that there's been this period of innovation when one system collapses, i.e. paganism, and another system comes up, i.e. Christianity. And I think we're just reverting to type. So it's normal for human societies to be held together by myths, dogmas, rituals, things you don't question. And this is just a new set of them that's doing that. Certainly, I would say that it is known that religiosity, traditional religiosity, is associated with mental health. But that could just be a genetic issue because, of course, it's going to be the traditionally religious that was selected for, so they're going to be healthy and whatever. I would assume on an individual level that being forced to tell yourself to believe in lies may well be bad for you, and it will come out occasionally in cognitive dissonance and getting triggered and getting terribly upset. It's a sort of mental effort. So that may well be the case. And we discussed, was it the day before yesterday, this idea of high narcissism in Eastern Europe, in communism, as a way of coping with all these negative feelings as a consequence of forcing yourself to believe lies. So I would think it would on the one hand, it would be negative, but on the other hand, if you're quite high in anxiety, then you'll be able to, that is associated with extrinsic religiousness, i.e. conformity to the current thing. And so I think it would, if anything, allay your concerns and your anxiety, that you were able to force yourself to believe in these lies. So perhaps it could be good for mental health. It's a difficult question.
Professor, where can people find you online?
I'm on the Jolly Heretic on YouTube, so please subscribe over there. And I'm on jollyheretic.com, which is my Substack, where if you like what I do, you can support me for the cost of a pint of beer a month. And I live stream on Mondays, where I talk about sort of based questions and whatever, at the moment with Mr. Grannon, who some of you may be familiar with. And you can get all my books on Amazon.
Thank you for a fascinating discussion.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
As always, stay curious.